Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off. Remember the last thing we talked about in the last set of notes, bleeding Kansas, that the balance would no longer be in place with free states and slave states. So now you're going to see how the division will take place and we will have a new political party form, and that is the Republican Party. All right, so in 1854, the Whig Party split and Northern Whigs joined a new political party. The party's goal was to stop the spread of slavery into the Western territories, and they became powerful force in politics, and actually they're still in place today. In 1856, they ran its first candidate for president, and that was John C. Fremont, the Army officer who helped California win independence. They had a strong anti-slavery campaign, and the Democrat James Buchanan was elected, but Republicans won in 11 of the 16 free states. In March of 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a blow to anti-slavery forces in the case Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved person who had once been owned by a U.S. Army doctor. He did live for a time in Illinois and Wisconsin with his owner, and the doctor then settled with Dred Scott in Missouri. Scott sued for his freedom and argued that he was free because he had lived where slavery was illegal. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court, and the court decided that Scott was not a free man for two reasons. The first being he had no right to sue in federal court because African Americans were not citizens. So even though he was living in a free territory, they are saying that he is property. And living in free territory did not make an enslaved person free because slaves were property, and property rights were protected in the Constitution. The court stated that Congress did not have the power to prohibit slavery in any territory, and this then made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. And I forgot to mention, and I'll put it in the classroom posting, I found a short little video to further explain the Missouri Compromise because I forgot to explain that to you guys before we started that first section of notes. So I apologize for that. Supporters of slavery were happy because the decision meant that slavery was legal in all territories. Northerners were shocked at the decision. They had hoped that slavery would eventually end if it was restricted in the North, but now basically it could spread to the West because they found through the Dred Scott decision that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. An Illinois lawyer that spoke out against the decision was Abraham Lincoln, and he had the idea that African Americans could not be citizens. Was based on a false view of American history, and he would become a central figure in the fight against the spread of slavery. He had a brief career in politics, and after serving in the Illinois state legislature, he was elected to Congress as a Whig. He voted for the Wilmot Proviso. He served one term and then returned to Illinois to practice law. He opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he was a longtime rival of Stephen Douglas. And remember Stephen Douglas from the last section, he was the author of that Kansas-Nebraska Act. And little funny side story is both men, they also did not really like each other because they both courted, which means dated, Mary Todd Lincoln. So obviously Mary Todd Lincoln eventually married Abraham Lincoln. So that even upset Stephen Douglas a little bit more. In 1858, the Illinois Republicans chose Lincoln to run against Douglas for Senate. Lincoln accepted the nomination and made a speech in favor of the Union. In his speech, he never said that he wanted to ban slavery. Southerners believed he was an abolitionist, but he never even mentioned slavery. He didn't even talk about it. He did say, and this is a famous quote by him, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not believe this government can endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. So kind of like he sees that this is really going to have a negative impact on the country. He kind of is sensing that we will divide. We will not be able to stay together. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, and this is a historical thing that actually took place in our local area in Ottawa, Illinois, if you ever wanted to learn more about that. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of public debates. Many would gather around to hear them speak. Douglas defended the idea of popular sovereignty. So he tried to get people to think of Lincoln as a powerful abolitionist that wanted equality for African Americans. He stated, that whole popular sovereignty, that the people should get to decide whether or not they're going to be a slave state or a free state. Lincoln insisted that there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence: right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sadly, for anybody that was a supporter of Lincoln and his beliefs that everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, Douglas did win the Senate election, and they would run against each other in 2 years for the president. John Brown had led a series of attacks in Kansas during Bleeding Kansas. He was actually driven out of Kansas, and then later he returned to New England and started a plot to raise an army and free those who were enslaved in the South. In 1859, he attacked Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and his goal there was to seize guns in the U.S. Army the U.S. Army had stored there. So he was trying to get ammunitions and guns. So obviously that's going to make people a little nervous, like, why is he trying to do this? He thought enslaved people would back him up, and he would give them weapons and lead them in a revolt. It was not a successful raid. He was surrounded by Colonel Robert E. Lee's forces, and 10 of his followers were killed, and Brown was eventually wounded and captured. He was found guilty of murder and treason, and he was sentenced to death and eventually hung. People in the North mourned his death because he was fighting to free slaves, and he was thought of as a hero. The Southerners are upset that the North was praising a man who tried to lead a slave revolt and tried to get the slaves to overthrow their power and authority. So through that, they were convinced that the North was out to destroy their way of life. We have the presidential election of 1860, which is a very pivotal point in our history. The long debate of slavery was leaving the nation divided. Either you were for it or you were against it, people felt. Republicans would choose Abraham Lincoln as their candidate, and the Democrats are divided on who they should run. The Northern Democrats want Stephen Douglas, and obviously the Southern Democrats picked Vice President John Breckinridge. And the Southerners formed the Constitutional Union Party and nominated John Bell of Tennessee. So that's the problem that the South did. They didn't try to everybody band together and have one candidate that they would all get behind. Instead, they split their support amongst 2 candidates, and that weakened their whole argument and what they were fighting for. The Southerners are still hopeful to bring the country back together. They felt that they could still do this. The results of the election of 1866 revealed just how divided the country was. Lincoln won every free state, and Breckinridge won every slave state except 4. Bell won Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, and Douglas won Missouri. So Lincoln only received 40% of the popular votes, but he received enough electoral votes to win. And as you know, that's oftentimes an issue that comes up when we talked about the presidential elections. For example, the most recent president, President Trump, at the time of this recording, that he did not win the popular vote, but he won the electoral votes. So people say, well, that's not right. We should go off of how many votes they get. But that's not how our country is set up. We are set up through the Electoral College, and that is oftentimes when people say, maybe we should get rid of it, and there are arguments for or against it. But Lincoln is one of them that only received 40% of the popular vote, but did win enough electoral votes. Succession will begin right after that election. The Southerners feel as though they no longer have a voice in national government because as Lincoln was portrayed and people tried to make him sound like he was an abolitionist, he was against slavery. And like I said earlier, he never said he was against it. He just felt like everybody was entitled to what was stated in the Declaration of Independence. South Carolina will be the first state to leave the Union, to secede on December 20th of 1860. And this is the progression of the states that leave. These blue states, South Carolina was the first, are the ones that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is the first place where the war begins, okay? And then the gray states are the states that seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter. So once Fort Sumter falls and the war has begun, these states right here leave the Union. The greenish states are the border slave states that did not secede. They just kind of stayed there. And obviously the red are the Union states. All right, and that is, I'm sorry, I've got all these pop-ups. That is the end of our discussion for this second section. So if you need to fill in your notes, please go ahead and do that. Thank you.